that I was part of the I Belong group, and I got the chance to have the mentorship of Kamila, who's sitting right here as well. But unfortunately, there are many young writers who are not so lucky. It would be great if there were creative writing courses organized in school level. At school level, there are some organized at college level. There are some at Behria as well. So I know about universities. But in schools, sadly enough, there are not enough workshops, not enough creative writing courses, and it would be great for young writers if that could be organized. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say one thing here. Yes, I agree with you, Kiran. Creative writing courses have not been accepted by the academia, at least where universities are concerned, because it doesn't sound to be too academic a subject, or it is not a content subject. But I definitely feel that there is a growing awareness and an understanding of how important it is to have such courses at the university, because people they are encouraged to read and then make their own meaning and express themselves, and that is really what literature is all about.
And I'm struck listening to the student work or recent student work, emerging writers, let's say. It strikes me that I think today, in today's politically charged environment, that Pakistani writers, and specifically young Pakistani writers, but Pakistani writers of all generations, have a potentially great role to play in shaping discourse, and I'm reminded of that when I hear your poem "Overdue Revolution," or whether it's a discussion of a minority community here in Pakistan. That there's great work to be done here, and I think that through fiction and poetry, that can be. That's of course why we're all here today. But I'm curious to hear more from that in the rest of our discussion. I wanted to, without further ado, move on to Ishrat Lindblad, who joins us here today. She was born in Lucknow and moved with her family to Pakistan in 1947. And because her father was in the railways, he was posted to most of the big cities in Pakistan, so she's lived all over this country. She graduated from Kinnaird College in Lahore and has a master's in English from Punjab University. She taught literature at both Kinnaird and Forman Christian College in Lahore, and then after her marriage moved to Stockholm in 1962. Did her PhD in 1971 in English literature at Uppsala University and has taught there at the English department, and has been teaching as an associate professor at Stockholm University until she retired in 2007. And during her sabbatical years, she's been a guest lecturer at several universities and also acted as co-principal of the Lyceum School here in Karachi on 3 separate occasions. So as you can see, she has brings a experience on different continents, and again, a mentorship of young people. So without further ado.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I feel very much an outsider because I haven't actually been following specifically emerging Pakistani writers. I've basically read the ones that have hit the headlines in the Western press. And that, in fact, brings me to what I think is one of the most important issues, and that is the language issue. Because it seems to me that what really changed, thanks to the author whose name can apparently not be named, but in 1980, the appearance of Midnight's Children absolutely changed the attitude of Western readers to the Indian novel. And I think one of the contributions that he made, for which all of us can be extremely grateful, is that he made English people recognize Indian English. And suddenly, expressions that were very familiar to us in Urdu, like Dil ka tukra, ya Chand ka tukra, when translated into my piece of the moon, became extremely poetic English. And I remember making a study of Midnight's Children and the Indianization and the root of so many of the expressions, and I realized that this was a kind of renewal of fiction that European fiction had been waiting for. And he also is often cited as the first person to have brought magic realism to the English novel, because in fact, the English writers were still very much bogged down in characterization and the realistic tradition. They hadn't really got over giants like Jane Austen and Charles Dickens and George Eliot. And so the overpowering shadow of these people, culminating in Henry James. And I remember an English writer saying to me that after Henry James, the only thing you could do with the English novel was to allow English to break down, because he pushed it as far as it could go in naturalistic writing. I think, too, that this enormous admiration for the appearance of Midnight's Children in 1981 and the whole burst of energy in Western fiction with the magic realistic novel becoming part of the English tradition changed the attitude of Western critics and Western publishers. They became much more open to accepting Derek Walcott, Naipaul. Lots of people subsequently entered the European scene. They won Nobel Prizes. Derek Walcott had a Nobel Prize. Naipaul got the Nobel Prize. The Turkish writer has got the Nobel Prize. So it's opened up the attitude of the Western world to the Eastern world long before the terrorists struck 9/11. And so I think we must take into account the fact that the Western attitude to people who use the English language has changed. When I entered my university career at Uppsala University, it was very important that we taught British English. Some rather progressive people were prepared to accept American English. But if you really wanted to make a career as a teacher of English in Sweden, you better sound as much like a true British Pakka Sahib as you possibly could. And if you sounded American, well, maybe you went off and studied American literature, but there was a very strong prejudice in favor of the King's or the Queen's English. And BBC English as well, because if you wanted a job on the BBC, you certainly had to speak something that sounded reasonably like British English. But today, regional accents are accepted. People get jobs on the BBC speaking Indian English and West Indian English and Chinese English. And right now, there's a team from the BBC in Singapore doing a study of Singlish, in other words, Singapore English. And the head of my department at Stockholm University is a specialist on Chinese Englishes. So not only English, but they talk about the Englishes of the world. And so I think the attitude of the Western world having changed to the acceptance of an Indianization means that we can now read books like the books by Kamila Shamsi that play with Urdu and English, are sort of resting in two linguistic cultures in a way that we never could expect them to be accepted. And I think that what happened was a kind of change in literature for English studies, similar to what happened when somebody like Joseph Conrad, a Polish writer, started writing English. There was this enormous renewal of the language. And Western people are very, very happy about that because it fills that need for something new, something original, which has inspired not only Pakistani writers, but Western writers as well. I also think that we need to think about the economic aspect, and you've mentioned it in relation to publishing, but I think we ignore too the impact of the success of the Indian novel in English. I mean, the fact that there are so many gifted Indian writers who are writing and publishing in English for a long time now, for the last 20 years, means, of course, that we have the spin-off benefit. India now enjoys this enormous economic boom, which means that people are interested in investing in India, they are traveling to India. India has almost become old hat. So what next? Something very new and exotic, Pakistan. Why not Pakistan? And then I think there is the problem of the definition of what we mean by Pakistani writers. Do we mean Pakistani writers because they were born in Pakistan? Do we mean Pakistani writers because they're living in London but they're writing about Pakistan? Do we mean Pakistani writers because they shift between one culture and the next? The same problem of definition that comes up in the academic field every time you talk about post-colonial literature. That do we mean that the colonization is past? Do we mean that it's literature that comes after colonization? What exactly does this term mean? You have the same problem when you talk about women writers. Do we mean writing by women, or do we mean writing about women? So I think all these issues enter into the factor of emerging Pakistani writing. I was very interested in what Munisa said about poetry, and to me it seems perfectly logical, because in Urdu we have a very strong poetic tradition, and you can really see that the majority of the big names in Urdu literature that are invited to this literature festival are women and men poets who are writing in Urdu. And this, I think, also reflects the East-West divide, because in Western culture, poetry has been the prerogative of the elite from the very beginning. I mean, Elizabethan poetry was court poetry. And the minute you got spread of mass literacy in the middle of the 18th century and the rise of the novel and the rise of the middle class, you got a different kind of fiction which appealed to a different social group than this very elite courtly group. And for example, one of the reasons why Shakespeare never published his plays was because there was a stigma attached to being a playwright, but there was something fine about being a poet. So he could publish his poems, and you can see they're very carefully edited. They have his name. They're very, very carefully produced and published within his lifetime. But his plays had to wait until he had been dead for someone else to think about publishing them. And that's why we have very good editions of Shakespeare's poems, but not of his plays. As far as the presence of talent is concerned, I was very moved when last week I was teaching a course to the foundation year at the Indus Valley School, and I asked them to practice writing a sonnet. And we were talking about the classic Elizabethan sonnet, and then as their assignment, they had to write a sonnet. And I said to them, the important thing is to follow the rules of the sonnet because it forces you to discipline your language. There were 135 poems, 135 students, and I was amazed at the number of poems that were really very, very powerful and moving and very original. So although they mightn't have successfully followed the language form, their grammar was faulty, their syntax was not the best, but they had got the rhyme scheme and they had got the emotional power of a poem. And some of them were so powerful that I really wish that I brought them with me to read. So there is obviously a lot of talent, and I think that exists in poetry because we have a very strong native tradition of poetry. So Urdu poetry, yes, but who in the West is reading poetry today except the elite? You know, poetry is for the poets. That's what T.S. Eliot said. And I mean, I think it's really true that poetry remains for the poets, but fiction is for the people, so it doesn't surprise me. I'd also like, finally, to say something about the themes that I think become particularly Pakistani. The question of honor killing is something that is very interesting to the West. There's a lot of discussion. Bapsi Sidhwa's The Bride, for example, goes down very well in European university courses. And there is also the question of feminism. And I was rather horrified to read the first story by Nadeem Aslam here about the terrible rejection of the female baby when it's born. And those kinds of things interest Western readers very much indeed.
Thank you. In our remaining time here, I wanted to pick up on some of the themes that you mentioned about, I'm intrigued about the discussion of elite writing or elitism, specifically one argument that I hear a lot in terms of our tremendously popular fiction writers of Pakistani origin is that there is a charge often lobbied at them that they're writing about the 1% or 2% of experience of Pakistani people. And I wondered if you are seeing, if my distinguished panelists are seeing different trends emerging in terms of people writing about not just the experience of going abroad and returning home, but also other themes, other communities, a diverse socioeconomic bracket outside of the elite. Is that something that people are noticing? Yes, please.
I'd like very much to name the book Salt and Saffron by Kamila Shamsi, which I had the pleasure of reading very recently. And that's certainly about the class divide. I mean, Salt, the cook in the kitchen, and Saffron, the elegant courtly culture of Lucknow. and the fact that somebody from that elegant tradition actually dares to marry into a servant background, even I was shocked. I thought, is it at all possible to think in such terms? And also Sehbaz Sarwar, Black Wings, I think, deals a lot with a kind of problem related to class. And again, another book by Kamila Shamsi, In the City by the Sea, where the young man Sajjad, or in Burnt Shadows, her most recent book, the young man whom she falls in love with, the Japanese woman, is actually not of the same class as the English people. He's more or less like a servant to them.
Yeah. Manisa, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, not really, actually. I mean, it's just that I think, well, not so much class, but I think you are getting English language writers who are not from English-speaking backgrounds, whose first language was not English. And so, inevitably, they bring to their work partly a knowledge of the literature and language, which was their first language, which was spoken in their home, which is kind of different to the English-speaking writer to whom maybe your grandmother speaks Urdu, but you do not, or your mother speaks Urdu, which is very different to belonging to a home where your Urdu is the spoken language, or Punjabi is the spoken language. And I think, well, in the diaspora, of course, you've got, actually what's happened was with the movement to the diaspora, there's also been this kind of confusion. I mean, you have someone like Nadeem Haslam, who came from a very literary family in Pakistan, but which was not well off. And he went and he lived in Huddersfield, in a sort of working class area. And so he's kind of writing from within the working class. And they're not, one of the most